For over 8 decades, foreign governments, rival aerospace manufacturers, Cold War adversaries, and the immutable laws of aerodynamic physics all committed the exact same fatal error when calculating Boeing's vulnerabilities. They assumed the threat would come from the outside, from Airbus subsidies, from Chinese industrial espionage, from supply chain disruptions, from the cyclical brutality of commercial aviation economics. They were all catastrophically, lethally wrong. The force that crippled the Boeing company did not arrive from any competitor's boardroom or any foreign ministry. It metastasized from within, from a 1997 merger that injected Wall Street's financial engineering directly into the bloodstream of America's greatest aerospace institution, and from the slow, deliberate, quarter-by-quarter decision to replace the engineers who built the safest aircraft in human history with the accountants who strip-mined the company for shareholder returns. Consider the sheer, harrowing litany of catastrophe this corporation has authored. 346 passengers and crew members killed in 2 virtually identical crashes within 5 months. Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, both caused by a software system that Boeing concealed from pilots and regulators to save airlines the cost of simulator training. A global grounding of the 737 MAX that lasted 20 months, the longest in commercial aviation history. A fuselage door plug that ripped off a 737 MAX 9 at 16,000 feet over Oregon, exposing a cabin full of passengers to the open sky because 4 bolts were never installed at the factory. Approximately $43 billion incinerated on stock buybacks between 2013 and 2019, while engineering investment was systematically starved. Internal communications revealing employees describing their own aircraft as designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys. A $2.5 billion criminal settlement with the Department of Justice, and an institutional betrayal so complete that the Federal Aviation Administration, the agency entrusted with protecting the flying public, had effectively delegated its safety oversight to the very corporation it was supposed to regulate. Any other aerospace manufacturer would have had its production certificates revoked, its executives indicted, and its brand erased from the fuselages of commercial aircraft worldwide. Any other company responsible for the deaths of 346 human beings through documented negligence, concealment, and regulatory manipulation would have been dismantled. Not restructured, not fined, but dismantled. But instead of vanishing beneath the weight of its own criminality, Boeing executed the quietest, most improbable survival maneuver in the history of American industry. It was too embedded in national defense, too intertwined with the American military-industrial apparatus, too systemically critical to the global aviation supply chain to be permitted to fail. The United States government could not let Boeing die, because letting Boeing die meant letting American aerospace supremacy die with it. And so the company endured, bleeding, diminished, its engineering soul gutted and replaced by financial machinery, a corporate zombie sustained not by the excellence that built it, but by the geopolitical necessity that prevents its burial. This is the story of how Boeing spent 80 years building the most formidable engineering culture in the history of flight, merged with a dying competitor whose executives then colonized its leadership, replaced the philosophy of build the best airplane with the doctrine of maximize shareholder value, and in doing so produced aircraft that fell from the sky, transforming the most trusted name in aviation into a case study in what happens when Wall Street greed replaces engineering as the soul of a corporation. To understand the full depth of this institutional collapse, we must rewind to 1916, to a wooden boathouse on Lake Union in Seattle, where a 35-year-old timber magnate named William Edward Boeing was hand-building a float plane from spruce and linen. Boeing was no casual hobbyist. He was an industrial obsessive who, after his first airplane ride in 1915, declared he could build a better machine, and methodically set out to do exactly that. He founded the Pacific Aero Products Company on July 15, 1916, later renamed the Boeing Airplane Company, but his true genius was cultural. He built an institution where engineers were kings. The people who understood stress loads, metallurgy, and the physics of controlled flight held ultimate authority. Accountants served the engineers. Salesmen served the engineers. The doctrine was religious. Build the best airplane on Earth, and the money will follow. That philosophy produced the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-29 Super Fortress, the bombers that won the Second World War. It produced the 707, which in 1958 obliterated the ocean liner industry and democratized international travel. It produced the 747, the Queen of the Skies, a bet-the-company gamble that nearly drove Boeing into bankruptcy in 1970 and then generated hundreds of billions over 5 decades. And it produced the 737, first delivered in 1967, which became the best-selling commercial aircraft in history. For 8 decades, Boeing was a synonym for engineering perfection. But Boeing's ultimate weapon was something entirely invisible on any balance sheet: institutional engineering authority. An engineer could halt a production line. An engineer could challenge a vice president. An engineer could delay a delivery by months for a safety concern and be celebrated, not punished. The premise was non-negotiable. The airplane is more important than the quarterly earnings report. In aerospace, a single catastrophic failure costs lives, regulatory trust, and decades of brand equity. Safety was not a department, it was the company's immune system. For 80 years, that immune system functioned with uncompromising precision. By the mid-1990s, the empire stood at its zenith. Boeing commanded roughly 65% of the global commercial aircraft market. Military contracts generated billions in defense revenue. The company employed over 200,000 people. Seattle was to Boeing what Detroit had been to Ford, a company town where 3 generations built their lives around the factory floor. But the higher the ascent, the more catastrophic the fall. And the seed of destruction was planted on August 1st, 1997, the day Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas. The $13 billion transaction was technically a Boeing acquisition. In practice, it was an invasion. McDonnell Douglas, a dying defense contractor, brought an entirely alien philosophy. Where Boeing worshipped engineering, McDonnell Douglas worshipped shareholder value. Harry Stonecipher, former McDonnell Douglas chief executive, became Boeing's president and immediately began re-engineering its DNA. Engineers were demoted, financial analysts and cost-cutters ascended. The phrase employees repeated was searingly accurate. McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money. In 2001, Boeing moved its headquarters from Seattle to Chicago, 1,700 miles from the nearest factory. The rationale: separate leadership from the business of making airplanes. Jim McNerney, who became CEO in 2005, was the first in Boeing history with no engineering background. A Jack Welch disciple from General Electric, who declared Boeing's workforce had been coddled. Under McNerney and his successors, Boeing spent $43 billion on stock buybacks between 2013 and 2019, while R&D budgets were slashed, experienced engineers pushed into retirement, and quality controls hollowed out. Boeing had not designed a new commercial aircraft since the 787 Dreamliner, itself delivered 3 years late with battery fires. The 737 MAX was not a new airplane. It was a financial decision in an engineering mask. The existing 737 airframe from the 1960s retrofitted with larger engines to compete with the Airbus A320neo. The engines didn't fit the 737's low-slung landing gear. Boeing mounted them farther forward and higher, altering the aerodynamics. To compensate, they added MCAS, software that automatically pushed the nose down. MCAS relied on a single sensor with no redundancy. Boeing concealed the system from pilots, and Boeing lobbied the FAA to certify the MAX without simulator training, because training cost airlines money and made the MAX less competitive. The airplane was designed to be the cheapest to operate, because cheapest meant more orders, and more orders meant the stock price would rise. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610, a 737 MAX 8, crashed into the Java Sea 12 minutes after takeoff from Jakarta, Indonesia. 189 people were killed. MCAS, triggered by a faulty sensor, repeatedly forced the nose down while the pilots fought to regain control. Less than 5 months later, on March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, another 737 MAX 8, crashed near Addis Ababa 6 minutes after takeoff. 157 people were killed. The same system, the same failure mode. 346 human beings dead because Boeing chose stock price over safety, chose quarterly returns over engineering integrity, chose the financial doctrine of a dead competitor over the engineering religion that had made it the most trusted name in aviation history. Yet, here lies the grim corporate truth that no amount of congressional hearings or criminal settlements can alter. Boeing did not die. It could not die. The company produces Air Force One. It manufactures the KC-46 tanker, the P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, the AH-64 Apache helicopter, and components for virtually every weapon system in the American arsenal. It is one of only 2 companies on Earth capable of manufacturing large commercial aircraft. Allowing Boeing to collapse would mean ceding commercial aviation supremacy to Airbus, a European consortium, and gutting the American defense industrial base simultaneously. So the government fined it $2.5 billion, grounded the MAX for 20 months, and waited. Boeing replaced its chief executive, paid the settlements, and resumed deliveries. Then, on January 5, 2024, a door plug blew off an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 at 16,000 feet because 4 retaining bolts were never installed at Boeing's Renton factory. The cabin depressurized. Passengers' belongings were sucked into the sky. By pure miraculous chance, the 2 seats nearest the opening were unoccupied. No one died. But the message was unmistakable. Boeing's quality crisis was not a MAX problem. It was an institutional disease. Fast forward to the present, and the damage is staggering. Boeing has accumulated over $30 billion in losses since the MAX grounding. Airbus has overtaken it in orders, deliveries, and market reputation. Over 33,000 Boeing machinists went on strike in September of 2024. Dave Calhoun, the chief executive who was supposed to fix the culture, resigned. His replacement, Kelly Ortberg, an actual engineer, was installed in August of 2024. In what amounted to an institutional confession that decades of MBA leadership had nearly destroyed the company. Boeing has not launched a clean sheet commercial aircraft program in over 15 years. This was not a repositioning. It was a declaration to the aviation world. We understand that we abandoned the one principle that made us great, and we are attempting, perhaps too late, to recover it. And so we are left with 2 irreconcilable visions of the Boeing company. The first is a monumental indictment of the most destructive corporate philosophy ever applied to a safety-critical industry. The systematic replacement of engineering authority with financial optimization, the deliberate elevation of stock price above human life, the merger that allowed a dying competitor's executives to colonize and dismantle an 80-year engineering culture from within. 346 people dead, a door ripped from a fuselage in flight, $43 billion in buybacks while engineers begged for resources. The phrase, designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys, written by Boeing's own employees about Boeing's own aircraft. The second vision is older, heavier, saturated with a grief that every aviation engineer on Earth recognizes. The memory of a company that once represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering achievement. The 747 breaking through clouds on its maiden flight. The 707 shrinking the Atlantic Ocean from 5 days to 7 hours. The Flying Fortress formations over Berlin. A company where an engineer's word could stop a production line with zero corporate consequence because the airplane, the actual physical, life-carrying airplane, was sacred. They built the ultimate corporate mechanism of engineered trust and then sold it for stock buybacks. Because sometimes, hidden behind the simple blue logo of Boeing, there is a quiet, invisible war. A war between the engineers who built it in 1916, the financiers who colonized it in 1997, the 346 souls who paid for that colonization with their lives, and the diminished, bleeding institution that still carries their name. Proof that in aerospace, when you replace the people who build airplanes with the people who build spreadsheets, gravity does not negotiate.